The Southern California area is full of freeways, including the famous 405, giving robbers, crooks, and thieves of all sorts the various getaway routes that are essential to their master plans. A favorable place, if you will, if something needs doing that requires a quick exit. And by the 1980s, the Los Angeles area had become our country's bank robbing hub. See, bank robbery rates were skyrocketing across the nation, but even so, Southern Cali was still seeing an average higher than anywhere else, even with the inflated national numbers. And 1980 itself wound up a peak year for the bank robbing scene down on the lower West Coast. It was the year that Norco, a prideful American town outside of Los Angeles, was set under siege when a religious fanatic and his crew decided to paint the streets red on the fateful and deadly day of May 9th. Now for context, we need to go back a little bit to the 1960s and 70s when fear was motivated in some people by the caution of a possible societal collapse due to the radical actions that had swept through the country the previous 2 decades, when liberation and radical groups were operating in full frontal public view. For example, the early 70s were a violent time that included serious acts of extremism, including a total of well over 2,000 bombings. This is also coming from a time where the thought of nuclear war was burned into people's minds, fueling a further paranoia. There was constant tension and propaganda everywhere, kind of like today, just minus the social media. It's not hard to imagine people being caught in extremism like this. The age of the internet has just helped spread sporadic extremist ideas faster than back then, but it hasn't changed the fact that people are still radicalized sometimes rather easily. You'll soon see how extremism drove these 5 armed individuals to follow through with their plan to rob a bank. Extremist ideologies have always spread and they always will, unfortunately. I know, I'm from Oklahoma City and I will never forget the horrific acts committed by a man that was brainwashed and driven by extremist ideologies. You all are familiar with April 19th, 1995, which took the lives of 168 people, including several children. Now, let me introduce the eventual mastermind of this robbery, George Smith. He was once a military man who served for a couple of years overseas in Germany working with artillery. He was in his late 20s and someone who for a long time held strong atheist beliefs. He rejected societal norms, including religion, but that eventually changed with him becoming a Christian during the religious youth movements from his era, leading him into an obsession with the rapture and the apocalypse. Now listen, I'm not saying Christianity is extremism. Let me clarify that before I upset anyone. But almost all belief systems and cultures do typically have some form of an extremist subculture, which is what George's beliefs quickly escalated towards. He was able to sway people with his extreme biblical beliefs and apocalyptic prepping propaganda. Because of such, a man named Chris Harvin, who George worked with, was soon intrigued by him. I mean, Chris was absolutely captivated by George Smith. You could basically say they eventually built a platonic life with one another when they bought a house together in Mariloma. I'm not insinuating anything intimate between the two, nothing intimate that I've found. I know it was more of just a kindred spiritual vision that brought them closer than blood. Their bond over the world possibly imploding into an orderless society of chaos was like mixing baking soda and vinegar. It was bound to explode before eventually fizzling out. Chris Harvin was now swayed with George. George Smith's preaching was simple. As a former dreamer of anarchy, he went through a metamorphosis, trading his furious rebellion for a religious fixation. Preaching that almost every single action should benefit one's need of preparation for the impending rapture, or a possible nuclear showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union. And George's plans were originally just as simple: reject society, prep for doomsday, and cash in on their marijuana harvest. But the harvest didn't work out. Now, past the radical 60s and 70s, there was another boom sweeping our nation. The bank robbing boom was now being felt up and down the streets like an earthquake, and it wasn't showing any signs of slowing down. So couple the bank robbing boom with George Smith and Chris Harvin's obsession with the apocalypse and the failure of their marijuana revenue together, and you get some desperate men ready to raise the stakes for the money they need to fund their doomsday prepper lifestyle, which almost sounds like something that would become a reality show nowadays. Their financial desperation and religious paranoia quickly led them down the road of planning a bank robbery on George's orders, and their first order of action was now to start recruiting. Soon after, the crew was set, including George Smith, The one-time artillery hotshot now turned apocalyptic preacher as their boastful leader. Chris Harvin, George's trusty cliché sidekick. The Delgado brothers, composed of Billy and Manny, and finally Russell Harvin, Chris's brother. George was obviously the man that was going to be responsible for planning their operation as well as building the bombs, which were IEDs. They began their preparations for the robbery with Smith casing the bank in its layout. He was orchestrating a plan to be in and out within 2 minutes and not a single second more. They began stockpiling weapons and ammo, from shotguns to rifles. Russell and the Delgado brothers were tasked with stealing a van, which they eventually stole from Gary Hakala after kidnapping him in a mall parking lot. With their weapons and getaway vehicles secured and ready, they were excited to set their plan in motion. The first act was to set the bomb off close to the site of the robbery beforehand and create a diversion, before the final act of actually robbing the bank. The days arrived. It's May 9th, 1980. They set out on their way a little after 3 in the afternoon, armed and vigilant. First, the robbers stop and they plant the bomb. They realize it's not going to detonate, but with desperation at hand, they decide to go ahead with the rest of their plan without the diversion. The men arrive at Security Pacific Bank branch covered from head to toe, barge to the front doors with their guns cocked and ready for action. Russell Harvin forces an employee to the vault and gathers some cash while the others dictate the customers in the lobby area. They wind up with around $20,000 without firing a shot inside the bank. With their 2 minutes up, they quickly exit, but as luck had it, there were police in the immediate area that were already responding to calls nearby. Deputy Belaski, arriving first, immediately started taking gunfire and returning it back at the bandits who were unleashing automatic rounds. Belaski struck George Smith in the lower body and hit Billy in the neck. Billy was now gone, leaving the rest of the crew with no getaway driver. The robbers, still firing, eventually struck Belaski, severely injuring him as Deputies Hill and Deputy Delgado arrived, not to be confused with the criminal Delgado brothers. The deputies were able to save Belaski and get him away from the ongoing storm of bullets. From there, the group of robbers hijacked another vehicle and started exchanging gunfire with Deputy Delgado again. With all the violence immediately ensuing after the robbery, the money wound up left behind. The robbers were now empty-handed with only their lives to fight for. During the pursuit, the robbers showed no remorse for anyone in their way, including civilians and law enforcement. Another victim of gunfire that day during the street pursuit was Deputy Parks, who was able to survive. For context, the robbers did say that they didn't intend to hurt the police, as they were just trying to take their vehicles out, but they injured almost a dozen people, including a child, during the chase. And as if things couldn't get crazier, the crew of heavily armed bandits started shooting at a police helicopter that was aiding in the pursuit. Bullets struck the helicopter and it had to make an emergency landing. The robbers kept fleeing and headed towards Little Creek Canyon in the San Gabriel Mountains. Unfortunately, though, tragedy is about to strike. As more police units had joined the pursuit, a one deputy Jim Evans was closing in. Jim Evans was a decorated ex-military service member and proud member of law enforcement. As he approached their vehicle, the robbers took position and outgunned the deputy, taking his life, solidifying their fate as cop killers. As soon as they ended their attack on the fallen Jim Evans, they turned their attention towards Deputy Jim McCarty, who originally was behind Jim. McCarty had an automatic weapon and was able to defend himself against the crew of killers until reinforcements showed up. After a day of shootouts and now on the run in the wilderness, George was starting to weaken due to blood loss from all of his injuries. Finally, SWAT closed in and apprehended the criminals without nearly any more conflict. George Smith and the Harvin brothers gave up without any further fight, but Manny Delgado, still armed, was taken out by SWAT members. The remaining suspects were now in custody with only tire tracks, bullet casings, and blood littering their trail. All three remaining robbers, George Smith, Chris Harvin, and Russell Harvin, were charged with several crimes, leaving all of them with life sentences in prison. May 9th, 1980 was a day that was paved into the streets and the hearts of all those negatively affected. Because when violent crimes happen, there's usually victims with families. It's the families that ultimately pay the price. I really appreciate you watching and listening. I hope you enjoyed this true but tragic story of real-life cops and robbers.